The air was thick with fog, the kind that clung to everything, blurring the world into a gray smear. In the heart of the city, the once thriving docks now sat deserted, a shell of their former self, abandoned by commerce but not by fear. The war had consumed everything, even the very idea of normalcy. Every night, the sky above the English Channel lit up with the bombs of the Luftwaffe, a relentless cascade of death. And yet, inside a cluttered office in the Ministry of Defense, there was only silence. Not the quiet kind of peace, but the kind of silence that comes before the storm, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your thoughts race. There was something deeply unsettling about it, an absence of action when every clock was ticking toward the worst possible outcome. In this room, high-ranking officers stood around a table, staring at a map of Europe that was covered in red pins. They were all too familiar with the hopelessness that weighed on their shoulders. The Luftwaffe, with its superiority in numbers and technology, seemed unstoppable. The RAF, once a force of great pride, was crumbling. It was the beginning of 1942, and the British Isles were teetering on the edge of a precipice. The planes that defended the skies were few, and those few were being shot down faster than they could be replaced. The Spitfire, the pride of Britain's Air Force, was too slow to handle the new threat that loomed above. There was no quick fix. No one had the answers. But there was one thing that everyone agreed on. The RAF needed more fighters, and they needed them fast. The solution wasn't coming from the front lines, though. It wasn't coming from the generals, who were still too steeped in protocol to see the true gravity of the situation. And it certainly wasn't coming from the government, which had its eyes locked on more traditional means of winning the war. It was almost as if they were waiting for a miracle to materialize on its own, as if the answer would come from someone else's brilliance or from sheer luck. But in a small, inconspicuous workshop in Southampton, a man was already at work, dreaming the impossible dream. R.J. Mitchell was not the kind of person one would typically associate with a fighter pilot's dream. He was neither large nor intimidating, nor was he a product of any aristocratic military family. He didn't come from a world of generals and strategists. He was an engineer, a designer, and his ideas were often met with skepticism, even from those who knew him best. He was known for his unyielding focus, his obsession with detail, and his uncanny ability to see things others could not. His mind moved with a speed and precision that few could follow, and yet, despite all of this, his success had come only in fits and starts. For years, he had fought for recognition, had fought against the limitations of his own position in the world. He had been pushed into the shadows, told that his designs were too radical, that they didn't fit within the accepted norms of aviation engineering. Yet here he was, now called upon to save a nation, to provide a fighter aircraft that could challenge the seemingly unstoppable might of the German bombers. What Mitchell didn't know, as he stood over his desk and stared at his sketch of the new fighter, was that the very essence of the war would hinge on his work. But to the outside world, he was just another engineer, someone with potential but no real recognition. No one had believed in him before. Why should they believe in him now? The authorities had their own plans, their own ideas. They were waiting for someone with higher rank, with more experience, to save them. They certainly weren't waiting for a man who was already considered too young and too inexperienced by the traditional standards of military aviation. They would rather rely on outdated models, make do with what was already available, than risk placing their faith in the hands of someone who was perceived as too small to have an impact. But Mitchell didn't wait for the higher-ups to make their move. He understood the urgency. He understood that time was running out, that every day that passed without a solution was another day the Luftwaffe grew stronger, more relentless. It was clear to him that the RAF couldn't simply throw more men at the problem and hope for the best. It was clear that they needed something different, something revolutionary. And so he began to work, to build, to design a plane that would not only stand up to the challenge of German bombers, but would exceed it in every way possible. There were no blueprints for what he wanted to create, no precedent to follow. Mitchell was forced to rely on his intuition, his deep understanding of aerodynamics, and his belief that there was a better way to achieve air superiority. His Spitfire, as it would come to be known, was unlike any aircraft that had come before it. It was a design born of necessity, of pure desperation, and yet it would turn out to be the plane that would go down in history as the hero of the Battle of Britain. But the journey to this moment was far from easy. As Mitchell sketched out the first design, his mind was filled with doubts. Was he really the right person for the job? Was this the right path to take? And even if it was, would the powers that be ever accept it? Would they ever give him the chance to prove that his vision could work? He knew the stakes were high, but the path was unclear. His designs were unconventional, and history had not been kind to unconventional thinkers. In a world governed by strict military traditions, how could one man's ingenuity possibly make a difference? The first prototype of the Spitfire was built in secret, far away from the prying eyes of the Ministry of Defense. Mitchell poured everything into it, his time, his energy, his dreams. But there were obstacles at every turn. Funding was limited. Resources were scarce. He had to work within the constraints of what was available to him. And yet he was determined not to compromise on the quality of his design. The Spitfire had to be fast, it had to be agile, and most importantly, it had to be deadly. He knew that if he could create a plane that could outmaneuver the Luftwaffe's fighters, then he could change the course of the war. At the same time, the reality of the situation was sinking in. Britain was fighting a battle on two fronts, against the Germans in the air and against its own bureaucracy on the ground. The Ministry of Defense was not interested in new ideas, especially not from a man who was still considered an outsider in their circles. Mitchell was working against time, against the tide of military conservatism, and against a system that had failed to acknowledge the value of his contributions. And yet, despite everything, Mitchell pressed on. There were nights when he barely slept, when the weight of the world seemed to bear down on him. The pressure was immense. He knew that if he failed, the consequences would be dire, not just for him, but for his country. As the days stretched on, Mitchell's conviction grew stronger. This was no longer just about designing a fighter plane. This was about survival, about preserving the very soul of Britain. And in the depths of the night, amid the clang of metal and the whir of machinery, he poured every ounce of his being into a machine that could defeat the enemy in the skies. But there were moments, too, when he questioned whether it was enough. Would his plane be fast enough? Would it have the firepower to take on the enemy? Would the pilots have the skill to wield it effectively? The questions lingered in his mind, but he knew that he couldn't afford to let doubt take root. The RAF needed a new weapon. The world needed a new kind of fighter. And so, Mitchell continued, driven by the knowledge that his invention, no matter how unappreciated by the powers that be, had the potential to change everything. He had nothing left to lose, and in that he found his strength. The crisis wasn't just about the lack of fighters. It was about a failure of imagination, a failure of leadership. The RAF had been caught off guard, relying on outdated tactics and underestimating the capabilities of the enemy. And yet, in the quiet corners of England, away from the war rooms and the political infighting, men like R.J. Mitchell were about to change the course of history. They were small, overlooked, and unassuming. But they had something that the high-ranking officers didn't: the will to fight with everything they had, to build what seemed impossible, and to rise above the limitations imposed upon them. The question now was not whether Mitchell's Spitfire could win the war. The question was whether the men in charge could recognize it in time. The cold wind howled through the open hangar doors, carrying with it the scent of oil and steel. Inside, the air was thick with the hum of machinery, the clatter of tools, and the smell of freshly cut metal. R.J. Mitchell stood at the center of it all, his hands covered in grease, his face pale from the lack of sleep. The noise in the workshop was constant, but in his mind there was only silence. A silence born of focus, a silence born of necessity. Every movement, every decision, every second mattered. This was it, the moment when everything would either fall apart or come together. The stakes were so high, the pressure so intense, that there was no room for error. His eyes traced the sleek, unfinished shape of the aircraft before him. It was his creation, the culmination of months of labor, of late nights spent sketching, calculating, adjusting. The Spitfire was far from complete, but even in its rough form, it already looked like something different, something powerful, something dangerous. It wasn't just a plane. It was a weapon, a symbol of defiance. It was a plane that could challenge the might of the Luftwaffe, a plane that could change the balance of power in the skies. And yet, as Mitchell stood there, staring at the aircraft, a wave of doubt threatened to overwhelm him. Would it really work? Would it fly as fast, as smoothly as he had envisioned? Or was this all just a grand, delusional gamble? 4 months now, Mitchell had been working tirelessly, pouring all of his energy into the design of the Spitfire. But it wasn't just the mechanics of the aircraft that kept him awake at night. It was the uncertainty of whether anyone would even give a chance. The higher-ups in the Ministry of Defense were slow to recognize the significance of his work, and many of the engineers who had worked on previous designs were resistant to the changes Mitchell was pushing for. But Mitchell didn't care about their doubts. He couldn't afford to. There was no time for hesitation, no time for compromise. The war was escalating, the Luftwaffe was growing stronger, and the RAF was running out of time and resources. It was an impossible task, and yet Mitchell had taken it on. He knew that the traditional designs used by the RAF weren't going to cut it. The Spitfire had to be something different, something that could outmaneuver the German bombers and fighters that filled the skies. But even as he worked, even as the shape of the plane began to take form, Mitchell couldn't shake the fear that he was building a dream that would never come to fruition. There was something deeply personal about this project for him. This wasn't just about saving the country. It was about proving to himself and to the world that he had the ability to succeed where so many others had failed. Mitchell had never been one to back down from a challenge. He had been dismissed, overlooked, and doubted his entire life. He was always too small, too unimportant, too much of an outsider. And now, here he was, standing at the crossroads of history, faced with the chance to change everything. But as the aircraft slowly took shape, the pressure began to mount. The design was radical. The airframe was sleek and streamlined, designed for speed and agility, rather than brute force. The wings were small but powerful, engineered to provide maximum lift without compromising maneuverability. The engine was an entirely new concept, designed to provide incredible speed and power without sacrificing reliability. Mitchell had pushed the boundaries of aviation engineering, making decisions that went against the grain of conventional thinking. But now, as the plane began to take shape, he began to wonder if he had gone too far. The more he looked at the Spitfire, the more the doubts crept in. What if it couldn't handle the stresses of battle? What if the engine couldn't keep up with the demands of aerial combat? What if the design was too radical, too unconventional to be accepted by the military? It was a terrifying thought, but Mitchell couldn't afford to dwell on it. He had already committed himself to the idea, and he knew that there was no turning back now. The Spitfire was his vision, and he had to see it through to the end. As the final pieces were put together, the aircraft began to take on a life of its own. The fuselage gleamed under the harsh light of the hangar, the wings stretched out like the arms of a bird in flight. It was beautiful, sleek, elegant, and purposeful. It looked like a plane designed for speed, not just for flying, but for surviving. It looked like a plane designed to fight. But Mitchell knew that beauty wasn't enough. The Spitfire had to perform. It had to prove itself in the air, in the heat of battle. And so, after weeks of hard work, the moment of truth finally arrived. The aircraft was ready for its first test flight. There was a palpable sense of tension in the air as the engineers and pilots gathered around the Spitfire. The ground crew checked the engines, made final adjustments to the wings, and ran through the pre-flight checklist. Mitchell stood to the side, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, watching intently. His heart raced as the pilot climbed into the cockpit. The engine roared to life, and the plane began to taxi down the runway. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the engine, the rumble of the wheels on the tarmac, and the tense silence that gripped everyone watching. Then, with a sudden surge of speed, the Spitfire lifted off the ground. It was as though the aircraft was alive, eager to prove itself, eager to show the world what it was capable of. The sound of the engine cut through the air, a deep, throaty roar that signaled the beginning of something new. As the Spitfire climbed higher into the sky, Mitchell's heart seemed to lift with it. It was working. The plane was performing beyond expectations. It was fast, agile, responsive. It handled like nothing anyone had ever seen before. The radical design had worked. Mitchell's gamble had paid off. But as the Spitfire soared through the sky, Mitchell couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was just the beginning. The true test of the aircraft wouldn't come until it faced the enemy. The Luftwaffe was ruthless, and there was no guarantee that the Spitfire would be able to stand up to their firepower. The test flight was a success, but it was only the first step. The real challenge lay ahead. Still, as Mitchell watched the Spitfire dance through the clouds, twisting and turning with ease, a wave of relief washed over him. This was it, the moment he had been working toward. The plane was everything he had hoped for. It was an embodiment of his vision, of his belief that innovation could outpace tradition, that a man with the right idea could change the course of history. But in the back of his mind, he knew that this victory, however sweet, was fleeting. The road ahead would be far from easy. The Spitfire had to be put into production, it had to be mass-produced, and it had to be tested in the heat of battle. There was still so much work to be done. As the plane landed smoothly back on the tarmac, the engineers and pilots gathered around, exchanging looks of disbelief. It had worked. The Spitfire had flown, and it had flown better than anyone had expected. But Mitchell didn't join in their celebrations. He couldn't afford to. This was just the beginning, and the real fight was still to come. But for the first time in months, Mitchell allowed himself to breathe. The Spitfire was more than just a machine, it was a symbol. It was a testament to his belief in innovation, to the idea that sometimes the most radical solutions are the ones that work. And now, the world would see what it could do. But even as the Spitfire took to the skies, there was one question that lingered in Mitchell's mind. Would anyone else see it for what it truly was? Would the men in charge recognize the value of his creation before it was too late? He had built the plane of the future, but the world wasn't always ready for the future. And as Mitchell watched the aircraft soar into the distance, he couldn't help but wonder if the powers that be would ever understand what he had created, if they would ever truly appreciate the brilliance of his design. For now, though, all that mattered was the fact that the Spitfire had flown. It had defied the odds. It had shown that, against all expectations, one man could change the course of history. But the real battle was just beginning, and Mitchell was ready to face it head-on, no matter what it took.